So today I want to give you a few tips and tricks that I use when I'm getting ready to start a new project using the long tail cast on. Now these tips and tricks have to do with estimating the amount of yarn tail that you need, or choosing a method that does not require estimating the yarn tail at all. What I do before I begin is decide whether this project fits into the small project category, medium project, or large project. And what I mean by that is, how wide or large in circumference is this project? A small project will be usually 8 to 10 inches wide or in circumference. So that would include things like socks, mittens, gloves, and scarves. All of those items are typically 10 inches or less in width or circumference. The medium width or circumference projects are going to be larger than 10 inches, but no more than about 22 inches in width or circumference. So that's going to encompass any kind of hat for any size human. And it's also going to include other sorts of projects or parts of projects. Like it might include the front section of a sweater or the back of a sweater, or it could be the entire circumference of a toddler or baby sweater. So anything that's 10 to 22 inches in width or circumference will fall into the medium project category. The large project category is anything that's larger than 22 inches, or really anything that has an extraordinary number of stitches that you have to cast on, so that having to start over is going to be a real pain in your rear. So in that sense, I tend to think of anything more than 120 or 150 stitches is worth it to me to use a method where I don't have to measure the yarn tail before I start. Now you might say, well, why would you ever measure the yarn tail if you don't need to? And the reason is that there is a cost to not measuring the yarn tail, and that is some advanced prep work or some follow-up work later on when the project is complete. And we'll talk about what that is in just a minute. So the first thing that you need to understand is that the length of yarn tail you need for your cast-on edge is 3 times the width or circumference of your project. So in other words, if your project, if it's made with stockinette, garter, or a regular knit purl pattern, so that the gauge is pretty consistent to whatever stockinette is, if it's 10 inches or 10 inches wide, then you need 30 inches of yarn tail in order to cast on your edge. You also, though, need a little bit of yarn tail for weaving in at the end. So give yourself 6 inches for that. So a 10-inch wide project is going to need 1 yard of yarn. Now, so you can say anything that's less than 10 inches, you could just reserve a yard. Now for the medium-sized projects, things like hats or sweaters or things like that, if you look at the upper end of that, the 22-inch range, then you need 66 inches plus your 6-inch yarn tail, which is 72 inches. That's 2 yards. So that's a simple way to break down. Anything 10 inches or smaller needs 1 yard. Anything 10 inches to 22 inches needs 2 yards. But the great thing is that you don't have to go get a measuring tape in order to measure out your yarn tail. The average adult, from the tip of their nose to the tips of their fingers when the arm is stretched out to the side, measures 1 yard. Now for me, I did take a measuring tape and I measured that distance out, and for me it was actually 32.5 inches. But I discovered that if I turn my head slightly, I can get a full yard if I need it. So if I'm going to cast on for a sock or a mitten or even a scarf, I know that I can pick up my yarn, hold the yarn tail, pull it out to the side, and I have enough to cast on for my scarf or mitten. If I'm going to cast on for a hat, then I know that I can give myself 2 lengths of yarn, and that's my ideal place to start casting on for a hat. Now this works for yarn weights from fingering all the way up to bulky. Once you hit super bulky yarns, those tend to need a little bit more yarn for the cast on. So rather than 3 times the width or circumference, you might need 4 times. The other thing is, if you find that you tend to cast on more loosely and you like that because it gives you more stretch, and you're finding that this system is always cutting you short, like you run out, then you know that, okay, when I have that size project, I need to do a yard and maybe a few more inches. You'll just learn that. But if you can categorize your projects, that will really help, and it will get you started on your cast on immediately and onto the first row of your pattern, which is what we're all looking to do, is to get going with the knitting. So the next thing that I want to show you are the two different methods for casting on without having to measure the tail, which you would probably want to do if you're having to cast on hundreds of stitches at a time. With the long tail cast on, you need 2 strands of yarn. Normally we measure off a tail and fold the yarn back over on itself and begin the cast on at the place where this transitions from the tail to the working yarn. But you don't need to do this. Instead, you can use 2 different balls of yarn, or you can use the two ends of the same ball of yarn. When you begin casting on using 2 separate strands of yarn, you have 2 choices for how to begin. One is to simply measure off the standard length of yarn tail for both strands. Pick up your needle, and you can hold the strands and the needle together to provide the tension for the yarn that you need in order to start. Now this works well if you cast on the continental way with both strands of yarn in your left hand. If you cast on with the English method, where you have the thumb yarn in your left hand and you are tensioning the working yarn in your right hand, this is going to be a bit awkward to start. So what you can do instead is create a slip knot using both strands of yarn, which you put on the needle. So you put that on the needle, and that provides your tension. This does not count as a cast on stitch. This is just a way to anchor the yarn until you get started. So you can cast on all of your stitches, and then when you've completed that, the thumb yarn, which is the one that creates this edge, is going to get cut. So you're going to leave a 6-inch tail for that as well. Going to cut it. This is the yarn that you'll continue to use to knit your item, and then these 3 yarn tails will have to be woven in. If you're casting on in the round, cast onto your circular needle. You have your 2 yarn tails at this end. When you complete your cast on, you cut the yarn, leaving a 6-inch tail. And when you go to join in the round, if you've made that double slip knot, you need to take that off the needle before you join in the round. Note that if you are working in the round and you're using the 3-strand method, all 3 strands are going to be hanging from the same location and will all need to be woven in from this place. So another choice you have when you are casting on using both ends of the same ball of yarn is that you can splice these 2 ends together, so that what you essentially do is create a ball of yarn that has no tails at all. So you can start casting on at any point, and then when you've completed the cast on, you cut your yarn tail and can continue knitting, and there are no ends to deal with at all. So with a yarn like this that is 100% wool, I can do a felted join to join these 2 ends together. So now this ball of yarn is one continuous loop. I've got my felted join right here, and I can begin casting on. Now, for a felted join, it doesn't really matter where I begin casting on. You may not be able to see it in the video, but this is where the join is. If I were to use another sort of join, such as the Russian join or a braided join, I might want to make sure that the join was part of the index finger yarn, the working yarn end, rather than the bit that's going to create the edge of the cast on. And the reason for that would be that some join methods create tiny little tails that can peek out. So if you can keep that join off of the actual edge and instead incorporate it into the first set of loops on the needle, that will make your finished item look much better. So this looks very much like a standard long tail cast on. There's no tail hanging down here, and what we have here is just this infinite loop of yarn that I can use until I'm finished casting on. So I have my thumb yarn here creating the edge, and the index finger yarn is creating the loops on the needle. So when I'm done casting on, I take the thumb yarn and give myself a tail, and I cut it. And so here I have a completed cast on with exactly the amount of yarn tail that I want, and then I can continue working with the rest of the ball of the yarn.